before. I'm actually more active now dealing with some of the current threats in technology through a number of different organizations than I ever was as a cop. And unfortunately, what you find is law enforcement is very, very inhibiting. And there are technical measures for most technical threats. Unfortunately, from a law enforcement perspective, the role of an investigator or a federal agent is not to develop strategies to mitigate threats. Their job is to investigate what the threat is, how you can attribute it to somebody, and solve a crime and prosecute somebody. Since I've gotten out, I've had a lot more fun fucking with the bad guys. I have a lot of data that I have access to now that I never could have had when I was a cop. I don't have to worry about things like wiretaps. We have people that are actively involved in, on an international scale, fighting crime at a totally different level than what I ever could have done when I was a cop. And I'm having a lot more fun right now.
I just want to add, I mean, to your point on that question, you know, there's a lot of conversation about advanced persistent threat. Everybody been hearing the buzz term APT this or APT that. And I often get asked, you know, what do you think the APT is? And I'm like, the minute I connect a device to the internet, I'm up against a persistent threat. It doesn't have to be a nation state. It can be organized crime. It could be some script kiddie. It could be some worm that's on the internet. That's a persistent threat. You know, and if it's electronic, some of them are sophisticated, so I guess you can call that advanced, some are not. So, I mean, there's a lot of dialogue around that. But I think one of the issues that kind of concerns me is looking at, I think when you start to look at, I've been doing some research, and when you start looking at things like the Uniform Crime Report and deterrence, when you go back to 1998, you look, and this is using data from the Department of Justice CSIP site, they have listed a whole series of cases that have disposition, meaning that the person's been charged, they're either doing time, you know, the court case has been wrapped up, or they're doing probation or what have you. And when you look at that, since 1998, and this was just a few months ago, there's only, you know, 60 plus cases, and again, this is at the federal level. This doesn't account for state or local, and of course, you know, I don't know how accurate their numbers are, so, you know, again, you know, treat it as an estimated number from CSIPs, but basically, you know, we're only talking 60 plus successful prosecutions, and then there's another 70 plus that are just sitting there awaiting disposition. And so how can you have real deterrence if, you know, one, you're not going to get put away, and this is data from 1998 to where we are today. So that's kind of, I think there's got to be some changes there, not only in how we track cyber from a uniform crime report, because it's really not its own category, but we got to, you know, one, it'd be great to have better statistics out there, but we've got to do a better job of deterrence and bringing closure to some of these crimes.
It's a really interesting, to answer your question, it's a really interesting disposition we're in, because we're the biggest target on the block, the United States, and we have the most, I mean, our Constitution is designed to give us maximum freedom and protect that freedom and protect personal privacy and freedoms, but the sheer will of doing that inhibits everybody in uniform's ability to operate. So let me simplify that. It's easy for the bad guys. When you have no laws, you have a blank sheet. You really can use whatever you want. When you have to play by the rule, it's a lot more difficult to have a street fight when there's rules involved. And we are up against we're in a fight where we have to play by rules and the other guys don't. And the other guys may not be a state, they may not be an individual, they may be a group, they may be an entity, they may be multiple personality, who knows? So I'm not sure what the answer is, but I just want to highlight the point. It seems to me, and maybe it's not the case, I'd like to hear what you guys have to say, but we have a whole lot of restrictions and rules because we, you know, as a collective, as a democracy, need to uphold that. But the sheer effect of doing that makes us kind of behind the eight ball when it comes to the ability to operate freely against an adversary that literally can take Twitter and use it maliciously. So I don't know if that phenomenon is shared with you guys, but I know militarily it was always like, I can't do this? I don't understand. And it was, well, you need the approval process. I know we had talked about it before. And it's important for you guys to know, if you haven't had any government experience, this is a big deal. I mean, we're all frustrated up here. We all want to do the right thing, but we can't. And what happens is when we don't do the right thing because we're trying to get the job done, somebody goes to jail up here.
You know what's really a bigger deal here? We've known about this cybercrime problem for more than 20 years. I worked at the White House for Al Gore in 1992. I personally told him and Clinton, do not commercialize the internet until the security issues are resolved. Because they're president and vice president, they're worried about a lot of other issues than my concerns about the internet. And a lot of other people, like Howard Schmidt and others, were telling him then, and nothing got done. When we talk about an advanced persistent threat, which is the latest government whiz word for this, you know, it's the war on crime, the war on drugs, the war on child exploitation. APT is just a word for something we had going on 15 years ago. 15 years ago at NASA, we were targeting 1,900 hostile sites that were targeting us, 2,500 offenders, under 100 cases, because there are multiple offenders in all these cases, on 65,000 attacks. 60% of the people we arrested were organized crime groups and carrying automatic weapons. 20% of them, as I said earlier, are foreign host nation state. The real problem we have here, the real issue, this conference is about mitigation. They're all about mitigation. The real problem is we have a problem to deal with we shouldn't have to deal with, and we're facing a larger problem. The larger problem is we have novel technologies coming online like biotech, nanotech, robotics, intelligent systems, and quantum systems that nobody is looking at for security reasons and nobody's regulating. And we have been the supreme predator on this planet throughout history. But this is about to change. Long before this century's over, our technologies are going to prey on us, and we're going to enable the process just the way we've enabled the process with cyber in these last 3 or 4 decades. That's the big issue, and it's the erosion of our civil liberties in the process with a lot of well-intended people doing law enforcement work like me. I never went to work one day thinking I'm going to violate somebody's rights, but we're just slowly eroding the constitutional fabric of the society, because to deal with these threats that he's talking about, we have to be more pungent as law enforcement and intelligence people to go after them, and we just erode our society in the process, which is exactly what the bad guys want.
As Ray Kurzweil would say, the singularity is near. Let me pull on that thread a little more about the frustrations I don't have to deal with now that I'm retired. The biggest piece of it is the incessant infighting within the federal government of different lanes, different fiefdoms, different pots of money, different control, all trying to solve the same problem, but trying to solve it from different angles and all tugging and pulling at each other. Several years ago, and I don't know if it's the same case you're talking about, but back in the 90s, we were fighting foreign intruders that were all over our networks and trying to work collaboratively across DOD, NSA, FBI, Secret Service, NASA was involved. It got so bad in this fiefdom stuff that certain organizations in the intelligence community even developed a caveat called secret, no FBI. Meaning that
That's actually true. That's a true story.
Yeah, it could be shared within the intelligence community, but not with law enforcement. It was just insane. And of course, law enforcement set up their own counter to that using law enforcement sensitive no FBI as the caveat, or excuse me, no NSA.
Because of the infighting.
Because of the infighting, yeah. And that insanity unfortunately continues today. I'm not saying it's any better in the private sector, but we seem to get along a whole lot better. My biggest competitor in the private sector is AT&T, as you can imagine. You know, there's a map for that, right? But we get along with each other. We get along with well, yeah, where'd the lawsuit go? Yeah. When it comes to fighting these common problems, the private sector works hand in hand. We're constantly sharing information with each other in a unified fight against what's going on. And it's beyond me why in the federal government we can't get one team together. It's just constant pulling. That's probably the biggest thing that drives me nuts. And I'm glad I've left it behind, not having to deal with that inside the feds anymore.
One brief thing, just to supplement, he's saying, go look at the December 1st edition, 2008 of Business Week, when it talks about the taking of NASA's secrets. In that article, you'll see about a thing with the Russians attacking us and taking all of our data. What was going on behind the scenes that isn't in that article and really wasn't a story for the reporter to tell is about all the bureaucratic infighting. This is a case that involved Russians in our country, inside our physical networks, physically, in person, talking to Russians over in Moscow. Now, I can't get into some things here, but basically, it was a case that was made, but we had to give it up in order to protect the intellectual property of the country and not pursue people for prosecution, because other agencies just didn't want to work and play well because they wanted to grab power and get credit. In the government, people can't work for profit, so they fight over power and credit. And it's the stupidest thing I experienced in 31 years, and I still get stupefied about it in retrospect, and it goes on to this day, just as he points out.
I echo those thoughts too, and I think that I'd be curious to know what you guys thought. There's a Wikipedia article when the U.S. Airways flight landed on the Hudson River. I don't know if you've seen the video of that crowdsourcing in real time, but it's really neat to see all the surrounding witnesses participate on updating the Wikipedia article. And they did a time lapse, and it showed like thread 1, 357, thread 2, 358, then started blowing up. That was a good example of a common issue, i.e. what is going on with the aircraft, sourced out to everybody with an online connection and 2 eyes, so effectively you had a sixth sense, which was the crowd, against the real threat. And I'm just curious, I don't know if this could ever work. I'm just curious to know, you know, when I was growing up, it used to be McGruff the Crime Dog and Neighborhood Watch. And everybody used to have that little sticker that I remember in the window with Neighborhood Watch and looked like a little robber, etc. I mean, is there such a way is there such thing as a citizenry that is for the greater good online? Is that real? I don't want to call it militia, but is there a citizens organization that protects the IP of America? Because really what will end the United States will be the persistent erosion of business, and anybody that's in business, that continued over time we can't withstand. So it's just something to consider. Using the Wikipedia article as an example of crowding, if we had a major event, just like the ham radio crew comes together, could a cyber entity come together and provide information? I've seen this work in Banda Aceh. I've seen this work in Haiti after the equation, and after the earthquake. I'm wondering if this could work in another realm. So just something to consider.
Real quick, we got a question up here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think Black Hat's probably a good example of that. Right?
Sure is.
One thing that strikes me as kind of a similarity between what we're seeing in the government and what we saw back during the dot-com boom was as soon as the internet sort of appeared on the scene and the business world was trying to decide what to make of it, a lot of big companies were asking the question, what's the role for the multi-billion-dollar media conglomerate in internet content? Turns out the answer was there is no role for them. Little guys with, 10 people and a website can put out content just like, the New York Times could. And we're seeing them sort of erode away over time. I think in some ways the government's asking a similar kind of question. What's the role for the multi-hundred billion-dollar defense industry and et cetera in securing people's networks? Is anybody asking the question, aside from perhaps John, whether there even is such a role?
Their first role is to secure their networks. They are so ate up,
well, clearly,
and they need to secure themselves before they start playing a bigger role in the national defense of this country in cyberspace.
Outside of that.
Well, the other thing I'd like to just add to this as well is back in World War II, we had plane spotters, Civil Air Patrol. People really understood that this nation was under attack, and there were fears that, we had incendiary bombs coming across the Pacific Ocean that landed in the Pacific Northwest. Where I live on St. Simon's Island, Georgia, we had tonnage being sunk right off the coast. And they finally had to convince people, my God, turn your lights off because it just lights up all the targets for the German subs. And so this modern civilian air patrol or cyber civil patrol, whatever you want to call it, I'd like to leave you with one URL because I'm working with a group that's doing something I think is extremely valuable. I was in the executive briefing last year at Black Hat, and they were talking about botnets, and I mentioned I'd written a paper for the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences 10 years ago called Robots, Wanderers, Spiders, and Avatars. And it was about law enforcement using these tools. And Jeff Moss said, well, that's very interesting. What are you working on now? And I said, I'm working with an extremely bright group of passionate, patriotic people that are working on attack attribution. And if you're interested in that topic, I'd ask you to go to this website. It's projectvigilant.us, all one word.
To John's point, there's a lot of different working groups that, there's the Zeus working group. Everybody's kind of targeting specific malware families or particular groups. There's the configure working groups. There's a wide range of them. You've got, things like the Internet Storm Center where, it's community-based efforts. So, there's pockets of it, but I think the challenge is there's really not a good coordination from a national perspective. How do you leverage all those different activities? And they're making a heck of a lot of progress and probably doing, improving the situation a lot faster than what the government can. But how can that be more coordinated so we're not duplicating a lot of efforts at the same time as well? And that's some of the issues. So, what's that? That's right.